This is a review for the Algebra Chapter 3 quiz. The first thing that you need to do is reset the memory on your calculator, second plus 712. When you reset the memory on your calculator, you have to make sure that you turn on your stat diagnostics. You do this by going to the mode button, going down to stat diagnostics, and right tabbing over to on, and you have to hit enter. If you don't turn on your stat diagnostics, your R value will not show up. Your correlation coefficient, your R value will not show up. So now with that said, the table below shows the winning scores of the championship softball game over the course of 6 years. So the first thing that we need to do, years always start with 0. So that's one thing that you have to remember. Everything else starts with a 1, but years start with a 0. So these numbers, 2010 to 2015, you are not going to type those numbers into the calculator. In your stat and then edit, into your L1, you're going to type in 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then in your L2, you need to type in the scores. So we have 9, 11, 10, 15, 16, and 18. Make sure after you type in 18 that you hit enter so that it goes into there. Otherwise, it won't. So always double check your data. The single biggest mistake that people make is not double checking your data. Now, question number 1 says, using your TI-84, find the linear regression equation for this data. So when we go to find the linear regression equation, you have to go to stat, tab over to calc, and then go down to number 4, which is linear regression. It asks you, do you want to use your numbers from your L1 and your L2? Yes, you do. So enter, 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 enter. It calculates it for you. Now, it won't say what to round to. You have to round to whatever your data looks like. If your data is to the nearest whole number, like these are, we're going to round to the nearest whole number. If your data is to the nearest tenths place, we want to round our data. We want to round our answer to the nearest tenths place. So when we take a look at this one, what we have here is we always have y equals, and you have your x. You could say f of x instead. All right, f of x and y equals are the same thing. Either way, that would be perfectly acceptable. So when we go to do this, your a value goes in front of your x. All right, we're looking for really ax plus b. That's how our y equals equation goes. So your a value is 1.85. We want to round to the nearest whole number because our data is to the nearest whole number. So that's going to round to be a 2. And then your plus b, we have 8.5. That's going to round up to be a 9. So that's going to be plus 9. Remember that you just ignore the r squared value. It now says, what is the correlation coefficient? Correlation coefficient is your R value. So our R value says 0.950314, blah, blah, blah. We ignore the R squared. We're looking at that bottom number. Normally, what you do is you round it to the 4th decimal place. That's sort of the standard. So 0.9503. Be very careful because sometimes you might have a negative number in front of your A value. Sometimes you might have a negative number in front of your R value. So be very careful to put that negative sign if you have a negative. Does the data have a strong, moderate, or weak correlation? Strong is in between 0.7 and 1. So this would be a strong R value. How do you know? Well, the R value is in between 0.7 and 1. Now, if we had a negative R value, we would have to say that the R value is in between negative 0.7 and negative 1. Be very careful that your reasoning matches your answer. So what will the score be in 2018? So looking at our years, year number 6 would be 2016 if we extend our table. Year number 7 would be 2017. Year number 8 would be 2018. Notice that it says, show your work algebraically. We have to make sure that we show our work algebraically. So what we're going to do is we need to take this 8 and we need to sub it in to here for x. So you're going to have 2 times 8 plus 9. You have to show that. You can't just use your table. Now, technically, you could type your y equals equation into your table and check it by the table, but we need to show it algebraically. So 2 times 8 is 16, plus 9 is 25. Just as a little side note, please remember that moderate, all right, moderate for your R value, moderate is in between 0.3 and 0.69. And then weak would be in between 0 and 0.29. All right, so be very careful there. Also, the negatives of those as well. So just be careful there. On the back of your quiz, it says the football team is selling hats H for $10 each and shirts S for $15 each. Their goal is to sell $5,000 worth of merchandise. Write an equation to represent this situation. Now, be careful. It says to use H for hats. It says to use S for shirts. You have to use H and S because the question specifically uses those letters. You can't just pick your own. So when we go to do this, hats are $10 each. So $10 times the number of hats, 10H, plus $15 for shirts, 15S. And their goal is to sell $5,000 worth. So equals $5,000. That's the equation. And remember, you must use the H and you must use the S. Be very careful because some people's S's look like 5s, right? So be very careful there. If they sell 20 shirts, how many hats must they sell to reach their goal? Show your work algebraically. So what we have is 20 shirts. We want to sub that 20 into the equation. So we're going to have 10H plus 15 times 20 equals 5,000. Now you have to actually do that calculation. 15 times 20 is 300. So we have the two-step equation, 10H plus 300 equals 5,000. Solve that two-step equation, minus 300 minus 300. So 10H equals 4,700. Divide by 10, and we get H equals 470. Now, one word of warning. You might get an answer that is a decimal answer. Sometimes you have to round your answer up. Sometimes you have to round your answer down. You have to be very careful about the wording of the question, whether you round your answer up or round your answer down. In this particular one, it came out to be a nice, neat whole number, so we didn't have to round it all. But sometimes even a number like if we had 470.1, in order to reach their goal, you might have to round up to 471. 470.1 would round up to 471. But other times, depending on the wording of the question, you might round down to just be 470. So you have to be very careful about the wording of the question. In question number 8, use hats for the x-axis. Use shirts for the y-axis. Find the x and y intercepts of the situation. Show your work algebraically and graph it. Remember to label the graph and the axes. Now, when it says use hats for the x-axis and shirts for the y, I'm going to go right to my graph. And this is normally your x-axis. This is normally your y-axis. So I'm going to label shirts and hats right away so I don't forget. Now, going back, we need to find the intercepts. So when you're solving for the x, you leave the x there. Now, instead of x, we're using hats. So this is really your x. This is really your y for shirts. When you're solving for the x, you want to leave the x there. So I'm separating it into two separate questions. If you're solving for the x, you leave the x there. So I'm going to have, instead of x, I have an h. So I have 10h plus, And then when you solve for the x, you want to sub in a 0 for the y. So 15 times 0 equals 5,000. You're solving for the x, you leave the x there. 15 times 0 is just 0 when you multiply, so that just disappears. So we really have the equation 10h equals 5,000. Divide by 10, and you get h equals 500. Now, 500 is not your x-intercept. You need to put it in as a point, all right? So as a point, all points are written x, comma, y. So our x value is really our h value, which is 500. So that's going to go in front of the comma. We subbed in a 0 for the y value. This is your answer. You need to write it as a coordinate. You need to write it as a point. For the next one, we're solving for the y, so we need to leave the y there. We're solving for the y, so we need to leave the y there. So 10 times 0, we're going to sub in for the x or the h, plus 15s equals 5,000. We're going to leave the y value there, which in this case is an s. 10 times 0 is just 0. That part just disappears. So we really have the equation 15s equals 5,000. Divide by 15, divide by 15. S equals 333.3 repeating. Now, again, that is not your answer. For our y-intercept, we have to write it as a point. All points are written x, comma, y. Our x value was a 0. Our y value is this 333.3 repeating. Don't round it, just leave it how it is, whatever number that you get. So this is our y-intercept. That's the correct answer. Now we need to go and graph these. Please remember that when you graph points, points are always written x, comma, y. Your x value is how many you go over. Your y value is how many you go up or down. So be very, very careful. So I labeled my axes. So now I want to graph my points. This point is 500, comma, 0. So I need to go over 500 up to 0. Well, what would be a good thing to count by going along the bottom? Could you count by 100s? Sure. Could you count by 50s? Sure. It doesn't matter as long as you're consistent. Remember that 0 starts right here. So if I count by 50s, I would have 0, 50, 100, 150, 200, 250, 300, 350, 400, 450, and then we have 500. I have the point 500, comma, 0, so my point right here is right there. For the other point, I have 0, comma, 333.3 repeating. So what would be a good thing to count by? I wouldn't want to count by 100s because then my graph is going to be really tiny. It wouldn't be wrong, but it's going to be a really, really, really tiny graph. So again, I'm going to count by 50s going up along the side. It doesn't matter what you count by as long as you are consistent and it fits. Remember, you can't make your graph bigger, all right? You can't extend your graph. So 0, comma, 333.3 repeating is going to be right about here. I'm going to connect my dots. Now, when you go to connect your dots, in this particular one, we're talking about hats and shirts. I'm not going to put an arrow on the ends of my line because I can't have a negative number of shirts. I can't have a negative number of hats. So I'm just going to leave it like that without arrows at the end. But you do have to label your line. So our equation of our line is 10h plus 15s equals 5,000. So I labeled my axes, I labeled my line, I have nice consistent numbers, and that's what you have to do. Be very, very careful with that graph. Your quiz looks exactly like those questions.